Just to share with everyone who's with us this afternoon or this evening, depending where you are. Sophie and I had a quick chat before the video was played, and we both made a really interesting discovery. And that was that we both feel that if we had watched that video a couple of years ago, we might have really disagreed. But now we actually pretty much do agree with the content. And so, Sophie, could you perhaps explain why your position from being anti-L1, if that's the right term, towards very pro-L1 in a principled way? How's that happened? Why has it happened? And what are its implications now for the way you teach?
That's a really good question. Do you know, when we said, oh, I'm going to ask you, Sophie, what's changed? I was like, well, I really have to think about this. But you know what? I remember when I was doing my Delta, one of the tutors asked me this question, and he said, you're not a native speaker. My first language is French. He said, so if you're asking yourself how your students are learning, all you have to do is reflect back on how you learned. It shouldn't be so hard. And I realized I was like, I don't know. I felt like I'd forgotten, because I think as a French speaker, as an English language learner, the way I was taught was, English, immersion. Don't use the first language, don't. And whenever I got to the level where I could actually reflect on my language learning journey, I just felt like I'd missed something, because I never really got to think, so how do I map what I'm learning in English onto what I already know in French? So then I just thought, well, I need to start reading about this. And Guy Cook was doing a presentation for International House, and and I read his book, Translation in English Language Teaching. And there was one phrase that stayed with me, Neil, and it just said, our students are not blank slates. It's a simple sentence, but it really stayed with me, because I just thought, if I'm saying, guys, it's English only, I'm assuming that I'm kind of denying that prior knowledge.
Yeah.
So it got me thinking, and I thought it was really interesting when you mentioned that you have a principled use of L1, because I wish I'd heard about that term principled, Neil, before I started thinking I'm going to use the L1 in the classroom, because when I started, it was a free for all. It was chaos. Because I didn't know I didn't have all those lovely activities in mind. So it just got a bit messy. So then I just had to start thinking, okay, how can I get this a bit more under control? And like you said, the idea of, using a text in a language, whether it's a listening or a reading, and get the students to respond in English. And now I haven't done that very often with listenings, but I do this with readings very often, because we can translate using Microsoft Word, using Google Docs. Translation is so easy these days.
Yeah.
So I would translate the text. So let's say if one day the students are reading in Slovakian, they'll answer in English. But the next day when we do reading, the reading will be in English, and they'll answer in their first language.
Right.
So I'm thinking there's input and output practice in both languages, so it's that bit more balanced.
Right.
But it's a process. What about you, Neil? What's made you change your mind? Because I think we come from the same school. I remember the sign saying English only in the classrooms.
So I think two things I just wanted to mention. The first one is a sign that is on the door of the student lounge in the school where I work. So this is where the students go to relax, have their lunch, socialize. And it says on the door, English only. And I just looked at that a couple of weeks ago, and I was thinking, this came from the recommendation of one of our teachers, who was like saying, it's unfair for the students to, if there's a dominant nationality, and as you're probably aware, working in Belfast, certainly here in the UK, there is Arab first L1 dominance in terms of the students studying in our schools at the moment. And quite rightly, the teacher wanted a space where the students were equal, and that, say, the Japanese learners didn't feel that because there were more Arabic L1 speakers there, that they were being disadvantaged. But I just really felt uncomfortable with this English only, and I just thought English preferred.
Nice.
Because if I'm a beginner in English, there is a limit to what I can say. And yes, the input that I will get from my fellow students, no matter how good they are, is actually valuable, because we've gone beyond the point that, oh, I'm going to learn mistakes from another language learner. No, actually, all input is valid in terms of interlanguage and interlanguage development. So I think the first thing is the recognition that there are times where actually the student has no choice but to use L1. It's just a common sense occurrence. So that's the first thing. I think let's be common sense about this. The second thing is that it came not out of reading Guy's work on translation, but it came out of a course that I was involved in a couple of years ago, working with a group of teachers in Cameroon. And so they're French-English bilinguals, but for many of them, their French is much stronger than their English. And because many of them have to teach both languages, there was a sense of kind of some of these teachers felt a bit nervous about the use of English. And the more I thought about it, and I spent time talking to people who were experienced teachers in Francophone Africa, they were saying, well, you know, in teacher development, what's wrong with French? If the teachers want to reflect on their growing confidence in English, can they write about, or can they send little videos in which they share with each other how they've improved and what they've done to improve, but share the knowledge in French, because then their English language level may not yet be good enough to express that really well in English. So it wasn't to deny them the right to use English. It was more to kind of create a fair playing field where the quality of reflection and the sharing of those ideas was more important than the language in which it was shared.
Interesting.
So there's kind of, I guess there's two or three things here, Sophie. There's the kind of the meta language development of teachers and giving them equal opportunities, not prejudicing them because their English may not be C1, C2 level. There's the wanting to recognize that people are going to use L1 anyway, so why should we fight it? And then there's the opportunities that I think you've talked about that we've seen through the work on translation, and increasingly now is coming through work in translanguaging and plurilingualism. So I think there's lots of methodological advances, but actually all stems from common sense, which is, as you say, if you want to build your knowledge in English, you've got to hook it onto something. And if you can't hook it onto anything in English, why not hook it onto your L1?
Yeah, and there's something you mentioned in your presentation, Neil, and when you say it's all based on common sense, I think as a teacher, if you think, yeah, but I don't know about common sense, how do I know? I think the key word that you used, I think, was scaffolding. It's a scaffolding tool. We don't use L1 in the classroom for the sake of using L1. It's used as a language teaching tool or a language learning tool. So like any tool, you don't use a drill if you need a hammer, right? So there are times where this is the right tool to use. Like you said, you can't deprive people, you can't deprive teachers, you need to talk about their reflection, their development because of their level of English, because the priority is to communicate the content.
Yes,
right?
absolutely.
So I think, I think it's about weighing, your learning aims. If scaffolding by using the first language will help your learners achieve your learning outcomes, I'll say yes, go for it. But again, that's how I sit on it, and I do sit more and more these days. I think whenever, I don't know about you, Neil, but whenever I trained, I mean, it wasn't yesterday. It was quite a while ago. It was a while ago. Probably shows. But at the time, there were, monolingual classrooms were a reality. Where I was living in Ireland or in the UK, the primary schools, the secondary schools, those were monolingual classrooms.
Yes.
The society was a lot more monolingual, definitely in Ireland. I mean, when I first moved to, everybody spoke English. Today, that reality's changed, and we need to change with it. And it involves shifting a mindset,
Can
because
I just ask, Sophie, just for the clarity of everyone, who's joining us today. Can you perhaps give a context to explain how the English-only dominance of a Belfast classroom has changed? I mean, I referred to learning German and the Turkish communities in Germany in a German classroom, but how has it changed so that perhaps people can hook your experience onto their experience?
I worked in a school in 2001 and I visited that school again a couple of weeks ago.
Mm-hmm.
The only thing that hasn't changed were two things, the building and the uniform. Everything else is different. The atmosphere is different. The school is vibrant. We now see signage around the school. Everything's multilingual.
Right.
So, the signs that say, bathroom that way, that's written in 3 or 4 languages. The languages are being represented. And that's something that, we're really encouraging the schools to take on board, to say it's not just that we have to teach those kids English, it's we have to develop our schools, we have to become multilingual, to recognize all those languages. They're huge assets. Now, I see children here in Belfast who say to me, I don't want to learn French or Spanish, miss. I want to learn Arabic because my best mate, Ahmed, he speaks Arabic. I want to learn his language. I think it's fostering a real sense of global citizenship.
Right.
Like, you mentioned as the SDGs, that idea of global, we are global citizens. And that's one thing I see now in the classroom. There's no such thing as a monolingual classroom. All the classes I visit have kids who speak 2, 3, 4, sometimes 5 different languages. One class I visited last week, there were more kids who did not speak English than kids whose first language was English.
Right. And I spent quite a lot of time living and working in Italy in the late 1980s and the early 1990s. And one of the things I've noticed in Italian society, and I know we have a number of people with us today from Italy, is that it was very difficult to find a Chinese or an Indian dinner in Italy. A, because Italian food is so fantastic, but also because the multilingual, multicultural society for which the UK is very well known wasn't necessarily as reflected in Italy 20, 30 years ago. Whereas now, if you go into Italian schools, you're going to have much more diversity in terms of the language groups and the ethnicities of the students, rather like the Turks in German schools. And I think if we're looking at some of the geopolitical changes, I know we've got some teachers from Ukraine joining us today. I'm not sure if you're in the Ukraine or whether you are outside of your country, but we send you all our very warmest wishes and regards. Thank you. We're seeing more and more Ukrainian children coming into schools probably around Europe. Poland is a case in point. So I think there's 2 issues here, isn't there? The classroom has changed, and the sense that an educational policymaker could say, oh, well, we've got a dominant nationality. We're going to privilege, I use that word deliberately, that nationality and no one else, to a reality now where that really is inappropriate, old-fashioned, and colonially very, very dodgy. I know that you were, so I think 2 things here. Going back to the practicalities, I remember we had a conversation probably about a year ago when you amazed me with the work that you're doing with your mixed nationality beginner classes in English as an additional language in Belfast. And that the fact that you've got lots of languages all happening at the same time. I thought it was wonderful. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you do, how you do it, why you do it?
Thanks, Neil. I think again, I'm going to use that word deliberately. I think I'm privileged to work with very multilingual classes. Now, I'm not saying that, every day is easy. It's not. But I'm learning so much. I feel like we're all learning so much. And there's something really nice about working in a multilingual classroom. Everybody is a language learner. I'm a language learner because I can't speak, the children's languages. Everybody is a language learner. So that we've got that kind of equity, right? One thing that the reason why I think it's important that those children still receive a bit of English and additional language help is that if their level of English isn't strong enough yet, and they spend whole days in a classroom, in subject classes, I think that gap, the kind of I+1, the level of challenge
Yeah.
is too great.
Right.
And I think, I don't know about you, Neil, but one thing that I've been hearing a lot over the last couple of days, over the last couple of years, is inclusion.
Right.
And
Yeah.
it's really got me thinking, because I think sometimes treating everybody equally is not treating everybody fairly. If we include all the children in the same classroom, their needs are not the same. So some of the children are in a classroom where they are ready to learn. They've got enough prior knowledge for learning. Some of them do not. How's that fair?
Mhm.
So there are times where I'll say, it's all about the funds of knowledge. And there are loads of really brilliant books for EAL, with Robert Sharples and Jean Conte. Brilliant, brilliant books. But there's really that huge emphasis on the funds of knowledge. The language of instruction, English, is not always the student's language for learning.
Right.
So when we welcome Ukrainian students, we know that their schooling was not interrupted until they were forced to leave their home country. So we know that they have learned a lot of things, but they've learned that in their language. So if we say to them, no, 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 you've got a test, it's English only. Well, is that fair? No, we're depriving them of the opportunity to showcase
Right.
what they know. So I always say I think as teachers, I don't know, what do you think, Neil? I think teachers like to be in control. And relinquishing control is something that can be quite challenging, and it does take practice. But I say, let the children draft, a text in their first language if they can. Because like you said, for the cognitively challenging task, processing content and in a different language, it's like doing two things at the same time. I say, do one thing at a time, but do it well,
Reduction
right?
of cognitive load.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
think so. So, draft in your first language, and then if you can, use a translating tool,
Okay.
to translate that text into English. Or I'll say to the children, get the kids to do homework. If they give you a piece of homework that's in Polish, use your phone. We'll have Google Translate, Google Lens. I'm not techie savvy by any stretch of the imagination, but I know I can translate. It may not be perfectly accurate, and it won't be perfectly accurate, Neil, but it'll give me a good enough idea as to what the child tried to do, and it's giving me a fairly good idea as to where they're at
Right.
and what they need help with.
I think two things come to mind as you were explaining that. Number one is as you say, it's not about equality, it's about using equity to
Very
create
much
a
so.
process to remove barriers. So if we're thinking about the school generally, they're Ukrainian learners or Turkish learners in Germany, that what we're doing is we're continuing to prize what they know in the language that they know it, and to take away the barrier, which is perhaps the old-fashioned attitude of the role of English is, in order to remove that systemic barrier so everyone's in the same situation. I'm also aware that that's quite a unique situation, perhaps for schools in the UK. And I'm conscious
Possibly.
we've got people with us today working in perhaps quite different contexts, potentially largely monolingual, perhaps with a few people from different language backgrounds. And I was very taken by something that you also said about how, not necessarily with young kids, but teenagers and adults, I think that actually they were a ladies group, they were low level, and that you were teaching them functional language in English, how to shop, how to go to the doctor. But you had a system by which the groups would, when they were working with an activity, they would then go into their language groups, which you didn't understand at all, and they would be working on a task together, but you still felt that you could monitor learning, even though you didn't know a word of what they were saying. I just wondered if you could explain how that works, because that was a real insight for me.
I think it's really about taking a step back I think monitoring, Neil, is a key part of our job. And I think no matter what classroom we work in, whether we work in a monolingual classroom, in a multilingual classroom, I think monitoring often, we don't think about it quite enough, but it's such a huge part of teaching. It's really about careful, mindful observation of what's happening.
Mm,
Even if I've got students working in their L1 groups, if you monitor carefully, you can gauge agreement or disagreement amongst the group.
mhm,
You can gauge leadership, who's kind of leading the group,
mhm,
who's maybe, a bit shy. Because we can read that as teachers. We can read that from their interaction. We can read that from their body language, from their gestures. And I think it's really, it's about trusting that it's okay. If I can't understand what they're saying, it's okay. I can still see that they're on task,
right. So
right?
I'm trying to think of perhaps an example of how this might work in the classrooms of the people with us today. So if
Mm-hmm.
you've got a group of students, um, even where there's a dominant L1 and then there's a subgroup with another language, that you would put the students at times with the other language together.
Yeah.
And so if they're thinking about, I don't know, register, and which exponents would you use to express polite disagreement in a given context?
And
That,
that's fascinating because culturally we do that so differently,
yeah. So,
don't we?
so you feel that even though you don't understand the words that the people are saying, that if they are pointing at the right answer, but discussing it together and they're all nodding their heads, that monitoring can take place, even though we don't know the words that they're saying, because we can see they've got the right answer and we can see that there is meaningful interaction about getting to the right answer.
Very much so. One thing that I always find quite funny is when we have students in different language groups working, especially on functional language activities. And I think it's quite interesting to then reflect, say, okay, what group was the loudest? What group was the quietest? And,
Right.
I find that really fascinating conversations have happened, with students when they said, well, why are those people always so quiet? But why are you so loud?
Uh,
Why do you always interrupt? Why do
uh,
you take so long to respond?
Turn
And
taking.
that's fascinating because I think it's really that understanding of different cultures and how we all do things a little bit differently. And then I'll never forget there was that day where the ladies had that kind of penny dropping moment. They went, ah, right. So when I'm interested and I'm polite and I'm interested in what you're saying to me, so I must interrupt to show you that this is so interesting. But now I understand that in your culture, if something is very interesting, you take time to show respect that you are thinking about it because it was so interesting. So you want to take time before you respond. But it was that penny dropping moment when people realized, right, okay, we've learned about the language. Now we know how to do this in English, but also we've understood how we do this in our own language and how culturally that doesn't necessarily translate and how we need to not just learn the words and learn the phrases, we also need to understand the culture behind all those phrases. And I gotta say, I'd be really interested in finding out, what the other participants make of this, because I think it's quite clear that, we are supporters of the L1 in the class. Maybe we've given that away, Neil, maybe.
I think.
But like people to know that if you feel like this is not how you feel about it, it's okay also to,
Absolutely.
we're happy to have a conversation, you
And I think
know.
also that we recognize that we've both come from contexts where it was right to capitalize on the use of L1, but we also recognize that there will be contexts where that's perhaps frowned upon by heads of departments, by accrediting boards, by ministries of education.
True.
We've got a comment in chat from Carla. I teach English and Portuguese in Spain, and I actually feel that using L1 helps my students reflect on their own language as well.
Mm.
Interesting. Thank you very much indeed, Carla, and enjoy the recording. Can we
I
bring
agree.
the elephant into the room? And that is, someone tells you in a position of authority You can't use L1, it's not allowed, be it a head of department, a Ministry of Education, a school inspector. How have you had that issue, and how have you responded to it?
I've had that issue from heads of department, from funders, people who would fund our organization, from parents. Also saying, my child will not learn unless it's English only. The message is the same, and it's like a kind of visual image. It's probably not the best, but that's how I try to make sense of things. I always think it's like building a house, right? You want to build a house. How can you build a house if you don't start with the foundation? The foundation is key. The foundation supports the house. The foundation is the first language.
Right.
So if that foundation is not being used, then your whole construction is not as stable as it should be. So it's just the idea of saying, look, we will let students use the L1 when we deem that it's an appropriate learning tool for them, when it will help them achieve their learning aims. We won't just use, they will learn English, and if anything, they will learn quicker. Because it's not that they will not be using English in the classroom, they'll still be using a lot of English in the classroom. But like Carla said, it's great when you have students, having that moment. They go, right, okay, so this is how I say this in Portuguese, but I must remember that this is how I should say it in English. And the same thing with your example of the present perfect in English and how we would use the present in French or in Spanish or Italian. And I remember this as a student saying, oh, right, so when I want to say, I know my friend since 10 years, I need to remember that in English, it's I have known. But it was really useful for me to be able to go, right, okay, because I remember clearly I think it would have been still like a teenager, still at school, finding, why do I keep getting this wrong?
Yeah.
Well, it's L1 interference, and that's not a bad thing.
Yeah. It's inevitable, isn't it? It's part of the interlanguage system.
Exactly. Exactly. So in terms of heads of department, I tend to reassure. I say, come into the classroom if you're worried that the proportion of L1 use will be too high. I'd like you to feel reassured that it's still an English class. It does remain an English class, and the students are there practicing a lot of English. So I would say, the door is open. For the parents, one thing and it's something I've done with children for a long time now, and it always works, right? I draw a body on the board and I always highlight the heart and the brain. I always say, right, you speak Arabic and you speak English. What language is in your heart? It's going to be Arabic. What language is in your brain? English, that's the language you use at school. So if now I say to you, no more Arabic, what am I taking away from you? Your heart. Am I going to do that? I don't think so. Belfast is an interesting place for this because there's one argument that always works. It's like, show of hands. Who is a fluent Irish speaker? And you don't see many hands up because people here very few people would learn Irish. Hands up if you wish you were a fluent Irish speaker, all the hands go up. How come? How come you're not fluent Irish speakers? What happened? So, it's that kind of language to go, all right, yes, I suppose we can't really deprive people. Language is not just language, it's identity.
Yes. And, I think that's informed a lot work on accent and the English as a lingua franca core. So many of these things are interrelated. And as you were talking, I was thinking, well, if we're talking about L1 use, we're talking about translation, Guy Cook, we're talking about grammar translation method, we're talking about translanguaging and plurilingualism and the kind of the new understanding, but we're also talking about mediation. We've brought in inclusivity. And now I'm going to bring in something from Gabby, which I think is really
yes, just read that.
So I don't know if everyone's had the chance to see it, but it's a question about what many teachers do, which I think, and Gabby, it would be interesting to know whether for you this is a level-related prompt that we might say to our students, try and think in English. Now, this resonates with me because when I was learning Italian, one of the things I would always try to do before going to bed was to have my final reflection on the day, or what am I got to do tomorrow in Italian? Oggi non era male come giornata. Fin fine quello che mi è piaciuto di più, blah, 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 blah. And then getting up in the
Nice.
morning. Quindi oggi non sarà una giornata splendida perché ho questo esame che devo dare e non ho fatto i compiti. I've not done my homework. I've got an exam I've got to do. And by having these thoughts in the L2 that I was trying to learn, so for our students, having these thoughts in English, think in English, is a way of encouraging learning the language. Is there a danger? And Gabby said, yes, she thinks that is level related. Because of course, if you've got very little language, how many thoughts can you have in that language? But how do we fuse successfully? Can we fuse successfully this idea of try and think in English with the L1 is important too?
I think so. And I think your presentation answered that question beautifully, Neil. And I think it comes back to that word principled, right? And I think there's a time and there's a place. So for example, when you were talking about using the L1 during grammar explanations, there's a purpose to this. So, all right. And I think it's okay to signpost that to students as well. Say, right, now I'm going to give you a few minutes to process this in your first language. Because and again, you know why you're using that tool, because you want the students to be able to map, right? So when I say this in Portuguese, this is how I should say it in English, right? For example, if you're teaching vocabulary and you're using visuals, do the students need to be using the L1? Probably not. Because, they're learning a new word, there's a visual. So I'll still say to the student, there are times I say, right, when you learn that word, I would also like you to write a sentence with that word in English. Even for lower levels, I've been trying to learn Arabic for a couple of years now. My progress is shocking, right? But even then, I would still be A1. But I make a point of trying to think to myself once a day, to say something to myself in Arabic, even if it's a really basic sentence, like I see an apple, right? It doesn't matter. Just to make that point, I think there's a time and a place for L1, and there's a time and a place for, right, we're going to do this in English. Try to think about this in English. So again, it's down to that word that you mentioned, principled, I think. Gabby, what do you think?
Gabby, I don't know if you got access to the microphone and you can come and join us live.
What about you, Neil? What do you make of this?
I think yes, I think I agree. It was such an interesting question. To my shame, I hadn't really thought about it very much, but I think it's about as you said, it's the time and the place. So in a grammar presentation stage or part of a lesson, you might have presented the target language in English, in L1, or a mixture of the two. And then you use that moment in time to say, right, I want you now to think in your first language at lower levels, because that's probably the only language they can use to marshal their thoughts. What do you make of this? What's easy? We never really ask our students, do we? What's easy about this? What's challenging about this? What do you not get? We probably ought to ask that more. Have those questions happening in L1. Have the students discussing it in L1. And even if you don't share a L1 with your students, that doesn't negate the validity of the activity. Later on in the lesson, where you've handed over the language for the students, where, to use your example of even a basic A1 sentence, I see the apple, you're now owning the language. And that's where we could say to our students, I mean, for example, with Italian, there was a particular Italian actor whose accent I love. And I've always wanted to talk like him. So I'd sometimes try and say crazy stuff in a Nanni Moretti accent.
Oh,
just
big
because
fan of Nanni Moretti.
I just thought he sounds so great.
It does.
And that's the appropriate time to be just transferring everything into the L2. So it's matching your language instruction and maximizing the students' use of L1 to the appropriate point of the lesson that's taking place. I do think it's at higher levels advantageous before students go and do an exam at B1 level and higher. I always say to them, listen to some music that you like in English before the exam. Don't listen to anything in your L1. Immerse yourself. So when you get into the room, you're in L2. Sorry, that should have been L2. Listen to it in English. You go into your English exam, you've got L2 English in your head as you go in.
The L2 zone.
Gabby, are you able to join us? I'm not sure.
I'm here. Not sure. Oh, yeah, you can hear me. Hi. Oh,
hi, Gabby.
Sophie. Oh, we love you so much. And Neil, you too as well. This is such a lovely session. You see, I've been listening to you guys, and so many thoughts running through my head that, you know, trying to kind of not to interfere, because you know me, I always I'm the devil's advocate, and I always have something rather disagreeable to say. But really, I mean, this is I just don't know where to start. I have so much to say. I just want to really share one thing. You know, Sophie, I mean, you are a non-native speaker, just like myself, right? So it's very, very interesting, because when I was listening to you, there was this thought, like, you know, I was reflecting on my own learning of the language, and I've realized that when I started learning English, I was very reluctant to go back to my L1, in the sense that I never wanted to translate. So it's something quite opposite to what you have been saying, right? Because I mean, you were saying that the lower the level, the more L1 you should allow, or maybe, you know, you allow, no should. But in my case, it was but that was my own learning experience. When I was, when my English was really low level, I didn't want to translate. But something very interesting happened later on, because when I got to, you know, advanced proficiency level, that was when I wanted to translate. I mean, I don't know what to make of it, how to understand it. Maybe it's just my twisted mind, my twisted brain, but I kind of felt that certain nuances, like, you know, subtleties, like things were kind of lost on me, okay, because I never wanted to translate back into Polish. And then at the proficiency level, I kind of, it was almost like I don't know, like an eye opener. So there were certain words that I learned in English, and they only had a meaning to me in English, and then I translated them into Polish at a proficiency level, and suddenly I felt like these are two different worlds. I mean, I don't even know if I'm making myself clear, or if I sound like a mad woman. But I just want to say that really what I'm saying is that we are all so different as learners, right? And we can never put a finger on how people learn and how people think, because we are just so different. So I agree with you, Neil, that there shouldn't be a notice to the effect that L1 is not allowed in the classroom, because we cannot be imposing things on people. People are different. People learn in different ways, in many different ways. So we could be talking about preferred ways, preferred methods, but we can never say that this is the only one. So I very much agree with you that kind of excluding L1 is a wrong thing to do. But to be honest, I still don't know what to make of L1 in the classroom, if you know what I mean. I just don't.
I think
I don't.
In response to that, Gabby, I think it touches on something that Sophie was saying early on about inclusivity. And I think I remember years ago having a Finnish librarian in a proficiency level class. And for whatever reason, which actually probably didn't matter, she hated working in groups. And I spent she was here with us, and it's a teacher's course for 2 weeks. And I spent the first week tussling with this, thinking, oh, why doesn't she? And I just thought, I had a light bulb moment of going, why are you imposing your ideas about how languages should be learned? Why not just let her work on her own? The others work in a group. So I think in answer to your response, I think it's useful to give learners options, and then they can choose. And to even try out the things they don't think they're going to like, because at least they've again got a rationale for saying, well, actually, that actually it did work for me. No, it didn't. So I think in the case of having someone like you who doesn't really want to do this translation stuff, then we actually say, okay, with this activity, who wants to work using both languages at the same time? Work in the group over there. If you only want to work with one of the languages, you form a group over here. And you give the students the choice. Goes back to Sophie's point about teachers wanting control, and actually what we need to do so much is just surrender that control and do what's right for the learner. I had to surrender my control of group work is always right. Allow this learner to, she was a highly competent linguist. She was proficiency standard. Let's face it, she'd managed very well so far. So who was I to try and tell her that she was wrong? And that's the first thing. The second thing in terms of external control, the ministries of education, I think it is, and Sophie's touched on this, important to kind of open the doors and to allow all stakeholders to understand and perhaps be transparent. So, I think about the context here in the UK, which will be the same in Northern Ireland, of English language centres and who controls us. And I know that there are very interesting conversations taking place about L1 and its use in the classroom in a British Council accredited language school. But very interestingly, there is nothing in the guidelines
Interesting.
to say one way or the other. So I actually think we're getting to the point where if the teacher in their lesson plan, if she can state, at this point in the class, the students will do this in L1 because...
Because. I think that's the key word.
I don't think there's very far you can argue with that.
But I think that's the idea, Neil, having the, a rationale. It's not just a flippant use of L1.
Yes.
It's not, here's something to do. It serves a purpose. So if it's the right tool for the job, I'll say, yes, use it.
Yeah.
If it's not, I wouldn't.
Yeah.
But I think, Gabby, I don't think you're going mad at all. And I quite agree with you. When as a language learner, it wasn't until I got to much higher level of English that I started translating. So if anything, I can relate. I think it's just the way I was taught as well. We were just taught, you just have to process everything in English. And it was just only later which I thought, maybe I can try to translate. And that's when I realized that poetry is one of the hardest things to translate, and humor, because it's so connected to history and culture that it's fascinating. Really, really fascinating.
You just touched on another issue. You both touched on this huge issue that I think that this is something I really strongly believe, and it's the element of reflection and rationale and the word because. So you see, it's only, there is no definitive answer in TEFL, EFL. There is nothing that, I sometimes feel that some teachers really go into sessions and training sessions and webinars, and they really hope to kind of meet someone who can say to them, it's either this or that. It's this, don't do this, always do this. Like, people really want definitive answers, but this will never happen in teaching, because there's no such concept as a clear-cut answer or a clear-cut method. Everything is allowed as long as you can justify it, and as long as you've reflected on it.
I agree, Gabby. I think we say always go back to your aims. That's what we'd say, you know, on teacher training course, always go back to your aims. What activity are you using? What are you using it for?
Mm.
So, you know, do you think that at this stage using the L1 would help you achieve the aim of that activity, achieve the aim of your lesson? If so, consider using it there. But I don't think it's a gimmick. I don't think it's something to use for the sake of being, you know, global. It's not just global citizenship. I think it's that, but it's also a really powerful language learning tool, I think.
I'm not sure. I see that Svetlana has her hands up in the list of attendees.
So thank you very much for your very useful and very interesting and very clear presentation. It was very interesting and I learned a lot. And in my work, I'm trying to conduct lessons in English, though it depends on the level of the group. If the group is weak, so when I explain the material to the weaker group, I can use Ukrainian to be sure that they understand, that everybody understands. But I had the experience of working with Chinese students, so they didn't know Ukrainian and I didn't know Chinese. So we had to use only the English language, and it took a lot of efforts to explain to them everything what I wanted them to know, and but we managed to do this.
I think
So it was a different kind of experience for me. So it depends on the situations. Sometimes I think that sometimes it is worth drawing a parallel between L1 and English to show the similarities and the differences in the languages. But when I work with a stronger group, and I see that they understand me and understand my explanations.
And I think, Svetlana, what I'd suggest is something that Sophie was talking about. Maybe, and I'd imagine this teaching with the Chinese students, maybe it's online. Give them the opportunity to go into a breakout room and to have a discussion about what you've been working with and what they've been working with in Mandarin. And you won't have an idea of what they're saying. But if they're on video and you're in the breakout room and you can see their faces and there's enough language there that you can say, do you all agree?
Okay, so it was
thumbs down for that.
Last year. I worked with the Chinese students last year.
Okay, but I think there is an opportunity to work with students even when we don't know a word of their language, much as Sophie was talking about in her women's classes.
Yes.
Sophie, I think that's probably bringing us towards the end of the session today.
It's been so fun, Neil. Thank you so much.